from parenting or entirely environmental factors. This is where the psychoanalytic explanation of the refrigerator mother theory comes in, wherein if the mother is cold or is not entirely affectionate towards the child then maybe develops symptoms of autism or schizophrenia or other disorders. So this very, very heavily deterministic environmental or parental etiology came about to be, and obviously this really, really pathologized the child, and it placed a lot of burden on the parents that they are responsible for raising a normal child that will then eventually fit into society. So against this backdrop, Judy Singer wrote a paper in 1998 that was titled Why Can't You Be Normal for Once in Your Life? So she is actually credited with coining the term neurodiversity, and in this paper she talked about how the nature-nurture pendulum, which is used to talk about the development of a person, about how much contribution nature has and how much contribution nurture has to or should be swinging towards nature to understand certain different individuals who are not neurotypical, that is their ways of understanding and communicating are not necessarily the dominant ways of understanding or communicating, and this sort of different is innate. And this is where our main research question came in, why this emphasis on innateness, or why this emphasis on an inherent quality which was maybe related to the brain or the body that's present at birth and that's a priori to all other your socialization, your experiences and everything came in. So for it came in because there was this really, really pathologizing psychoanalytic and psychotherapeutic explanation of any sort of difference that was there, especially in children. And it also came about because in 1990s, which was termed as the decade of the brain in the US, because of brain research that was happening, and brain is understood to be this untouchable secular fact of the body, where anything that's in the brain, that's okay, that's natural, that should not be changed, that should not be cured. So that gave some power, that gave some authority to especially autistic activists to say that no, this is a part of who we are and this should not then be cured. So then brain became the basis of identity, neurology became the basis of identity, and this is wherein what then Francois Ortega termed as cerebralization of the self, where the self was equated with the brain. And that's where the identity part of neurodiversity comes in, that you believe that there is something inherent in you that makes you maybe be autistic, that makes you maybe have ADHD, and that is something that's a priori to all your later socialization, be it gender, caste, class, whatever, which later on I'll discuss about how that may not necessarily be true and may actually limit the movement part of the neurodiversity movement, because movements are built on intersectionalities, they're built on collective identities, wherein you can say that this is something that's connecting all of us based on our experiences, based on our commonality of experiences, or based on certain social facts or factors that constitute that experience. But because you're saying that there is certain things that are innately biological to you as an individual, you're basically coining or reframing the autistic brain, which has also ironically been the basis for a lot of eugenicist debates in the past.
Okay, the next question is for Kanika. In your paper, you mentioned the psychosocial model of disability in India, reflecting on 3 films with disabled or mentally ill women protagonists. You specifically talk about feminist consciousness and psychosocial disability as reflected in the everyday life of these characters. I'd love to know more about what this everydayness looks like.
So I would like to answer this question by citing examples from the movies that I've analyzed for this conference. The very beginning of the movie Three of Us, that begins with the women protagonist named Shelja, who is suffering from dementia. And through her, that we get to know how she is dealing with her everyday struggle. The movie, it is by the end of the movie that we get to know that she is suffering from dementia, and the audience remains clueless throughout the movie, but they have certain idea that, okay, something is going on with this character, that she is dealing with some sort of neurological condition, but it is till the end that we keep on guessing as an audience. So the everyday struggle, as far as everyday struggle is concerned, There are a lot of scenes in the movie. For example, she forgets to add salt in the food, and there's this awkward silence that prevails between her and her husband. Nobody talks. And then in another scene, there's her friend who says that, "Oh, Shelja, you forget everything." And sooner she realizes the intensity or the seriousness of what she has said. And as far as opening of the movie is concerned, the scene sets the tone of the movie, where she's just checklisting a to-do list, where she has written some pointers in her diary, such as bus number is 81, switch off lights, take your phone, purse, keys with you, and so on. So from there, the audience starts to contemplate that something is happening with Shelja as far as neurological condition is concerned. My second movie is 15 Park Avenue. There, the movie raises a pertinent question, that is, what is reality? What is real for an individual might not be real for somebody else. And this is highlighted through the character of Mitali, played by Konkana Sen. And she's suffering from schizophrenia in the movie. In this movie, there's this scene which highlight this everyday struggle. In fact, for her, being a schizophrenic, every day is a struggle. Every moment is a struggle, because people around her, they don't believe her, what she is saying. They feel that she's delusional, she's cooking up stories, and every single time. So they don't believe what is she saying. In one of the scenes, which is very thought-provoking, where Mitali just goes up to her sister, elder sister, and tells her that there's this man addressed as Tantric in the movie. He comes in her elder sister's absence and beats her, and because claiming that Mitali is possessed by some evil spirit. But her elder sister dismisses it off and tells her to go to bed and sleep. So the thin line between what is sanity and what is insanity, that concept, the idea is questioned through this movie. And my third movie, which is Phobia, there the character Mehek, she is suffering from agoraphobia. It is a fear of social interactions causing anxiety and panic attacks. In this movie, her condition is so severe that she doesn't come out of her home after, like, for 4 months. And there this situation comes where she has to throws off the garbage that is accumulated in her home, but she is so anxious that she can't step out of the door and to throw off the garbage because she is anxious that she might encounter somebody and then she has to talk to that person. So these are the everyday struggles, and such movies make, such visuals make those invisible struggles visible to the audience. So that's the whole idea of my paper.
Vasu, your work is autoethnographic. So you're using the lens of the self, your own standpoint, to critically engage with mental illness, disability, and higher education. What are the specific experiences which then turned into the lines of inquiry when it comes to these neoliberal ideas of productivity, of efficiency, or of success in higher education?
So there are two parts to this question. One is about the experiences that I have had, and second is them turning into how I started critically inquiring about the ideas of productivity, of higher education systems to begin with. And also I'd like to mention that I use the words mentally ill or mad for myself, and I firmly believe that there is no one correct or the perfect way of experiencing mental health conditions. Some people may use the word psychosocial disability, some may use the word persons with mental health conditions, and all of them are judged as valid. And before I go over to the mental health experiences, I also would like to give some background context. I am 24 years old and I come from a formerly untouchable caste from this small town in Nellore in Andhra Pradesh. We live in a Malada, Mala being the caste that I belong to, and Vada is basically a ghetto where calling someone is still an impossible task because you don't have enough network connectivity, and it is punishable if you cross the lines drawn by Apakash people, and I'm saying both literally and figuratively. So I have personally known people who were punished because they entered the houses of Apakash people, or they used the same roads, or they used the same wells to get the water from. And on the other hand, my brother and I, we have studied in an English medium school. Both of us engage in reading and writing. I'm sitting here on the panel. So more or less I look normal. I fit in the definitions of what society deems normal. So why am I here talking about disability, mental health, caste, sexuality, gender, every other marginalization that you can think of? Because all of these experiences are still or the experiences that I have experienced which have pushed me to the point where I am excluded from all these spaces, because India is essentially a caste society. It exists in the water that we get, in the lands that we farm on, in the places where you can walk and the places you cannot walk. So it's only a very narrow idea to think that caste only exists in these daily interactions. It moves beyond that. It works in the government offices. It works in the colleges that you get admission to. It works in the places where you get jobs. It works in the places where you get internships because of your uncle's friend's neighbor. So that is how caste works beyond languages, beyond regions, and beyond religions. So with all these background information, I am also psychosocially disabled. And to give a very, very minute example in my life, which I now realize is not as simple as I thought it would be. So my friend and I, an Apakash Brahmin friend of mine, and we were pretty young, and this one day we were just playing around, and we were talking about how my skin color is dirty because it's dark in color. And to prevent that, to do something about that, I started scraping it off with a knife. I started scraping the skin off my hand with a knife. And it looked very normal to me when I was a child, and this experience can be very easily written off as self-harming behavior if you go inside a therapeutic room, if you go inside if you go to a psychiatrist. So, but this is very much colored by untouchability, by casteism, by colorism. So, and I have not yet come to the disability part, but the 1 minute timer is here. So I'm hoping you very kindly give me the allowance to talk about it, since it's the last panel of the day. Can I?
I am donating 1 minute of my time. You can continue. No, I'm donating it now.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, when you come up with all of these experiences inside higher education system, which anyway are keeping you out because you don't belong here. It is a very popular saying that if you have done bad deeds in this lifetime, you get born as an animal or as a untouchable person in your next lifetime. But what if you are both untouchable and disabled at the same time? And the current statistics say that 2.1% of the entire population has disabilities, and in that 2/3 of the population live in rural areas. And the experiences of these rural disabled people won't be same as the experiences of the disabled people who are coming from upper class, upper caste backgrounds. And we do not have the statistics of how many of these people have severe mental health disorders and what are the experiences that they are having in higher education system. I'll talk about it in the next round. Thank you.
Okay, Upasana. The terms neurodivergence and disability are sometimes confused and used interchangeably. Could you share your understanding of these terms, how they relate to each other, perhaps the tension between the two?
Right. So to better understand that or explain that, I'll have to talk a little bit about the 4 lenses or the sort of 4 observations we used to understand neurodiversity or the construction of disability that neurodiversity has. So first and foremost, and maybe the most important, is the conception of impairment, or in the case of neurodiversity, the lack of conception of impairment that there is. So there are several models of disability. There's the medical model, the social model, cultural, political, several models that are there, but all of them more or less have a conception of impairment. The only difference is how do you relate to that impairment, how do you understand it, what's the relationship between the impairment, the individual and society, and so forth and so on. But with neurodiversity, what came out the most was, especially in this paper by Robert Chapman, who's like one of the key figures in neurodiversity, is that there is no such thing as impairment. There is just diversity. So everybody, because you have a different brain or you have a different way of being, everybody is just different. There is just diversity. And what is disabling is societal attitudes. What's disabling is stigma, and what's disabling is this one particular notion of how a person should be. So a lot of what came out was the strength-based perspective of diversity, wherein a lot of talk about productivity within education and within workforce was talked about, like articles in Harvard Health or the Wall Street Journal or these other business magazine, wherein how to best utilize your neurodiverse workforce, or how for educators, if you use this particular pedagogy, this particular method, then your neurodivergent students will be able to top the class or top the school or whatever. So this attachment to a strengths-based understanding of neurodiversity or diversity in this case, which would then allow for a more productive existence. In disability, this is more complicated. Disability allows for the fact there are some impairments that limit what you can or cannot do, that limit how you can function in your relationships, in education, in workplace. You may also not be able to work entirely, but what the focus is on the environment, how the environment caters to these different levels of disability, and also a person's life across a person's life, wherein their experience of disability also changes and different environmental structures or support may be needed for that. So the emphasis on the built environment itself and its universal accessibility. And then another difference, and a major difference also comes in about the understanding of intersectionality. So a lot of present critique on neurodiversity is about how it's like a global north-white paradigm, wherein it does not account for other marginalizations or other identities like race, queerness, etc. So with disability, it's been more proactive in the sense that social models and these other forward-looking models very, very clearly account for how identities like gender or identities like race very clearly interact with disability, and they constitute each other. So it's like true intersectionality. For example, if you take the example of caste, then the experience of womanhood for a Dalit woman would be very, very different from that of a Savarna woman. But in neurodiversity, what's happened instead is it's become additive. So you're just layering on the different identities rather than understanding how one is constituted by the other. And this is again because of the cerebralization of the self, because your brain or your identity is neurodivergent, is understood to be existent at birth, is understood to be innate to yourself, then all other identities, be it gender, be it sexuality, everything else comes later on and is added on top of that. So intersectionality kind of get muddled through it. Another difference then maybe of language. So I've talked about it in like terms of like neurominority, then the differently wired and all of that, and the cerebral subject which arise from the decade of the brain. So what happened a lot with neurodiversity is that they modeled their understanding of a community based on other ethnic minorities and racial minorities. Like the example of queerness was given a lot in the initial sort of landmark tests of neurodiversity, wherein they said that queerness was, pathologized in the DSM, and then it was removed from the DSM because it was understood that it's just a sort of natural way of being. But what's missed is that within queerness also it's understood that there is no like fixed queer identity that's there. There is no one way. There's no like gay brain or lesbian brain or like innate biological fact that makes it that. It's really very fluid, and it's also shaped by the environment. It's constantly in tension and interaction with the environment. But because neurodiversity like I explained, is understood into very, very particular way. There is this defensiveness about it, wherein it can only be particularly innate in a particular way, and then the environmental interaction sort of gets missed in it.
Okay, Kanika, this is a question in two parts, right? In your abstract, you mentioned trauma as a theme. I'd love to hear more about where trauma fits into your reading of these films. And the second part is your mention of caretakers. And I think that's interesting because we often think of psychosocial disability as residing in the person and not as something, disability as something that affects people around them. So could you tell us more about caretakers and how they're tied into your analysis of the film?
That's an interesting question, and I would like to address it by interconnecting both the parts into one, and also again by citing example through the analysis of my movies, because that makes sense, because in my paper I'm analyzing 3 movies. Trauma and the role of caretakers. I'll start with my first movie, that is 3 of Us. There, Shailja, she wishes to revisit her childhood place, Vengurla. Her husband, Dipankar, he takes off from work and accompanies her, and he goes with her to her childhood place before memory fails her. And in this movie, the role of caretakers are shown in a very positive light, be it Shailja's husband or her son or her childhood friend. They are shown that as if they are understanding her situation, they are empathetic towards her neurological condition. Though she has childhood trauma, that her elder sister dies in front of her eyes accidentally while playing. So she has that childhood trauma within her, but there comes the role of caretakers. And in this movie, the caretakers are really shown in a positive light that helps her, and the movie ends on a positive note, on an optimistic note, that Shailja has realized her reality, that she has to live with dementia, but she's very hopeful that things will turn in her favor, and that's how the movie ends. On the other side, in 15 Park Avenue, Mithali suffers from trauma on multiple levels. Like from childhood, her childhood was traumatic because she has seen that unsuccessful parental marriage. Then in her teenage, her elder sister lets her go on some job assignment where she's gang raped, and because of which her fiance calls off the marriage. So, and like I discussed in my previous round, that it is her mother and maid who call that Tantric Baba and who beats her up on multiple occasions. There we can see the contrast, clear contrast. Like in 3 of Us, there this positivity that is reflected through caretakers around Shailja, but in 15 Park Avenue, it's totally opposite. Similarly in phobia, Mehak is suffering from agoraphobia. She experiences that sexual assault by a cab driver. And after this incident, her sister, real sister, she gives up on her, saying that she has her own family and she can't stay with her. So now Mehak is living alone, all by herself. And in middle of all of this, while she's dealing with this mental condition, her boyfriend tries to make sexual advances without her consent, and when she says no to it, and her boyfriend calls her like different names like retard, psycho, sick, on multiple levels throughout the movie. So these are the cases which I wanted to highlight while discussing the trauma as well as the role of caretakers within it. So the role of caretakers is utmost important, I feel, and it may aggravate or alleviate the person's condition who's going from some sort of neurological condition. So that's my take on it.
Vasu, in your abstract, you talk about transformative change by reimagining classrooms. Could you share what the classroom examinations and accommodations might look like in practice?
Yeah. So in my first semester of masters, we were asked to describe the qualities of a good student. What does a perfect student look like? And everybody had answers around continually present, being productive, being attentive, managing time well, organized, all of that. And at least most of my friends and I, we never saw ourselves in those definitions of what a good student looks like. And we will never be able to fit into those concepts. And secondly, the education system also expects us to leave everything out of our context once we enter the classroom. As someone with a severe mental illness, or as someone who is taking care of someone with a mental illness, that caregiver burden, or basically being a caregiver, or being belonging to a marginalized section of the community in a society like this, you cannot leave all of that out just because you are entering a classroom, and that burden is never talked about. And secondly, the hierarchy that exists between the professor and the student, we never talk about that. It is always seen as a professor as the Brahman, Guru Sishya Sambandh that we talk about, and they are disseminating knowledge, and students just take everything and learn everything. But also, on the other hand, who is engaged in this process of knowledge production? For centuries, it has always been the upper caste people, upper caste able-bodied men who have been engaging in this process of knowledge production. That it's only in the past few decades, I was also telling somebody else about this, it's only in the last few decades that the people from the marginalized communities are countering these narratives, or of bringing back their own narratives of what knowledge looks like. Because somebody reading something in a foreign language is considered knowledge, but somebody who knows the art of making chappal with leather is not considered knowledge. And the knowledge again has different hierarchies to it. Knowledge with a capital K and knowledge with a small k, that we talk about, the everydayness of knowledge. And secondly, I also wanted to talk a little bit about how when you have a mental health disability, it is seen as a personal sickness, or a laziness even, or a lack of personal capacity. It is always individualized. It is never seen as even though it is a product of all the structural concerns that are coming up, and medical documentation that is required in the colleges that when you ask for accommodations. We are not able to get the medical certificates that we need because we may not be able to find the right doctor. Or for example, if I go to a doctor and talk about and disclose about my psychosis, maybe my gender affirmative treatment would be stopped then. So how do I balance both of that and get that documentation back to college to ask for accommodations there? And then even if I do, most of the mental health concerns are cyclical in nature. So if I take one accommodation now or ask for a deadline extension now, I cannot be entirely sure that this won't happen again. So how are universities equipped enough to handle these things? Yeah, thank you.
Like everyone has given really nice presentation in terms of like mostly I can simply say that I never thought in that way. So thank you for countering the narrative. Thank you so much for that. Vasu, I just wanted to ask one question. Like, can you please put some light on your methodology?
I'm Isha Aire and I'm studying psychology, and my question is for the entire panel. I want to understand that in the capitalist neoliberal society that we live in, what are the specific accommodations that can be made within education systems so that accommodations can be made for neurodivergent individuals with countering disabilities, like with different types of needs. So a person who has ADHD might have different needs than a person who has autism. So how do we, or a person who has a learning disability. So how do we make these accommodations?
Hi, my name is Anuradha. I am a therapist myself. My question is to Upasana. You talked about how one of the researchers has talked about that a neurodivergence or being autistic or being having ADHD is not really a disability unless you look in the social context in which it has been disabling for the person. However, a lot of people who do not get diagnosed early on do end up having a lot of other comorbidities, if you want to use that word, or a lot of other chronic illness, because people do not understand what it is to live constantly not being accepted, constantly not being understood. What do you have to say about that? While a lot of researchers go on, do very singular, isolated work and try to define language of what is disability and what is not disability, but often forget, like in my experience, I would love to know from you, forget to really elucidate the social context within which something becomes disabling or something is an impairment for the individual in the communities that they live in.
There has been some like internal tension because Asperger's was previously outside autism and now it's part of it. Like there is a difference between high functioning and low functioning autism, and a lot of criticism of neurodivergence as a paradigm comes from those with low functioning autism, which says that you have certain privileges if you also have certain abilities, and just because you're trying to push this strengths-based model does not mean that the rest of us maybe, you know, not need accommodations or not need certain access. With regards to disability, I think one of the most foundational paradigms or ways of thinking that I found were that disability is something which is most of us will experience at some point in our lives due to age, due to other factors, environment, whatever it may be. Even with neurodivergence, there are certain situations or certain contexts where our communication patterns or where our behavioral patterns may fit in very, very well, but there may be certain situations where, or context, or where we're in a different country or a different culture where they may not fit well, and we may feel that mental pressure or that sort of discomfort at being different, let's just say. So with disability, or social model of disability says that it's not just like a social justice issue, it's a very, very like universal issue in the sense that all of us are on a spectrum in some form or the other, and if we just keep focusing either on like on a minority which has like very, very few needs, or on a minority that has a lot of needs, and we just make them the representative of disability as such or neurodivergence as such, we're really limiting our framework, or we're really limiting what we can do with the environment as whole. And I hope that answered your question in some form or the other. Then another question came about, from what I understood is that children or people who do not get diagnosed with neurodivergence, and of course it's like, as women don't get diagnosed with autism or ADHD till much, much later, and then other racial minorities, or in India, because of access to psychiatrists or psychologists is based on your class and caste and other factors, certain other marginalized groups may not get access to these diagnoses, and these like diagnostic criteria, as like as much tension as they may contain, they're still very, very useful materially because they do provide you to access to certain accommodations, etc. So in absence of these, you may have like you may not even have the language to tell like what your experience might be, or for the other to understand what your experience might be. So one way, like a more long-term egalitarian way of looking at would be again to just accommodate like different ways of being, different ways of expressing, communicating, etc. without stigma or judgment in the first place. And the second would be to give credibility to lived experiences, not just in like psychiatric settings or diagnostic settings, but from the childhood itself. So through peers, through teachers, others, just a valuing of lived experience and of allowing, like a panelist before me talked about hermeneutic justice, where you allow them to, you know, give them the tools or allow them certain tools to then be able to understand or make meaning out of their experience, but also testimonial justice, where your understanding of experience, your experience is valued and given voice to and heard. And then, I'm so sorry I'm taking so much time, but just the last question about neurodivergence and accommodations for it within education and workforce. So two things. One is, because of lived experience of everybody is different, it has to be very, very subjective. Like each person has individual different needs, but also you can't always do it on like a case-by-case basis, because then each person will have to start the process all over again from the scratch, and it can be very isolating, time-consuming and exhausting to explain from the scratch for every person. So a solidarity or for that can be built or a responsibility for that can be placed on the environment itself, where you have certain basic accommodations or structures where each new experience can be accommodated and slight modifications can be made. And like Vasu pointed out, that this pressure of productivity, this pressure of being a certain way, it's not that you provide accommodation so that everybody can be productive or that everybody can be the ideal student. Accommodations also mean that you give space so that everybody does not have to be that, but they're still allowed and valued within classrooms or work contexts.
Yeah, so the first question was about the methodology. My methodology was autoethnography, because I believe stories are one way of accessing theory. And the question then comes, what stories? Whose stories? Who are narrating these stories? And whose stories are getting written as stories in the first place? Let me give you an interesting example for this. In the 1990s, when Mandal reservations were, the protests against Mandal reservations were happening, Savanna women came up with the posters saying, "Humko berozgar pati nahi chahiye." With the concept behind that was that if the reservations come, all the SC/ST OBC people will then get government jobs, so the general caste people won't get as much jobs as they were getting until that point of time. So all of them will become jobless. So unko general caste unemployed husbands nahi chahiye. And this is what gets written as story. This is what their reality is. This is what an upper caste analysis of Indian caste society looks like. So if we then talk about why does my story matter, or if the story matters at all, it is because for centuries these are the stories that were getting written as knowledge. It is only, there are only very few papers within the Indian context that talk about caste and psychology, that talk about caste and mental health disabilities. And that is exactly the reason these stories are very important. And secondly, I want to talk a little bit about the accommodations question. Specific accommodations could be flexible attendance or self-paced exams or anything. But then the question then comes, what if everybody gets a disability certificate and then they get to access these accommodations? But we also need to question, why not? What if everybody has a disability certificate? Because we are imagining education system as a place of exclusion and not as a place of selection. Everybody should have the right to education. But why are we eliminating some people? Because our idea of what an educated person should look like has a very specific upper caste, upper class, able-bodied, cishet man in our mind. And we need to move beyond that. And for that, everybody should have accommodations. Women should have reservations. SC/ST OBC people should have reservations. Persons with disabilities should have reservations. And it's not a question of mere representation. It is a question of reservation as well. And it's not, the concept of merit is not just a myth, but it is also a very violent myth. So I just like to end it by saying that we should focus on care instead of competition in academia. Thank you.
I want to just add a point, since nobody asked question on film or something which I have dealt with. Adding to what one of the, I think somebody asked about the solution in educational institution, I want to just extend it about the flaws that I found while analyzing these movies, that there is question of representation of what is able body and what is disabled body while representing some character in a movie. For instance, because I am addressing this issue because this is the best platform, so that I want my audience to take some food, like some ideas as a food for thought and think about it, ponder about it later. That the example is, there are two movies. For example, there's Margarita with a straw. I hope you have heard about it. There, Indian actress Kalki, she's portraying this illness of cerebral palsy. On the other hand, there's this series, Breaking Bad, where there's this character who is actually suffering from cerebral palsy, and he is portraying that character. So there has to be some contrast where you can analyze these two characters. One is suffering from it actually and one is not. So this is where I want to end. Thank you.
And the question also comes from one of my lived experiences. My grandfather had Parkinson's disease, and in the last 2 years of his progression of his illness, he developed Parkinson's dementia. And I saw my entire family, I have a joint family, and I saw my entire family really struggling with understanding how and whys of how the disease is progressing and how to provide care. And I feel like there is not enough being talked about in terms of caregiver burnout, let's say, when we're talking about able, disabled, and mental health issues and such things. So I just also don't know how to imagine what it would look like, this care for the caregivers also. And I don't know where to start the conversation about in terms of the caregiver burden or burnout. So I just wanted to know if you have any idea about that. I would want to give more reading or thinking about in terms of that domain.
Yeah. So while I was writing this paper, I found some policies that have been there on paper in Indian context as well as in as we talk like internationally. But as far as implementation of those policies are concerned, I really don't think that is happening at grassroots level. So I was going through that. There is some mention about the policies as far as role of caretakers and the people who are suffering from neurological conditions are concerned, but I really don't think that those policies that are written on paper are actually being implemented in real life. So, yeah.
I mean, my paper didn't deal with it, so I can obviously not go into it extensively, but I think there's an imagination of a family which is like unconditionally loving, but also like contains the disabled person and sort of, you know, prevents them from interaction with the outside world in a way wherein, you know, they do the entire care work and they're supposed to be selfless about it, but they're also, you know, supposed to take on this entire responsibility, which is, I think, kind of gives them too much burden, and B also puts a lot of power in their hand when it comes to decisions regarding like the lives and experiences of disabled people, especially if they're not allowed certain mediums to take those decisions for themselves and their lives are being spent at home. So I think broader imagination of it would include like a lot of institutions, obviously in like a more diffused manner, the broader care work that a society can do, but also like care work that we can imagine in places like schools or colleges where there are people or systems in place that can provide additional support so that this responsibility is sort of divided and not entirely on the family itself as we imagine it right now.
I'd just like to make one clarification regarding the point I made earlier regarding the what if everybody has a disability certificate. That doesn't extend unconditionally to all kinds of reservations, because obviously the kind of reservations that we are having, because SC ST OBC reservations हो गया, अब तो EWS reservation आ गया. But SC ST OBC reservations, we have them because these are constitutionally mandated reservations that we have because of untouchable that exists.
Okay, wow. That was an enormous amount of information and insight, and so thank you to the panelists, please. Yeah. I read the abstracts to their papers in advance, and while they were talking, I've completely lost control of my notes, because the kind of nuance you were bringing in, this document is now absolute gibberish, not because of because you were adding so much weight to the conversation that actually your abstracts were a small part of everything you've discussed today. So with that, I'm going to have to read this because I can't otherwise make any points. I was thinking, what is a narrative? Right? Narrative in its very basic sense is a spoken account of the self, the experience of the self, the everydayness of the self. And when you have many similar narratives, they come together to form these mainstream narratives. Or they try to tell a story of the normalization of the human experience. And when that dominant narrative forms, it kind of becomes inhuman in a way because it's politically deployed and it's economically deployed. And it's a structure that's then imposed on people, right? And while a lot of people do kind of fit under that narrative, many don't. And so the dominant narrative becomes so powerful that it decides what a legitimate human experience is. So then a counter narrative is formed of people's lived experiences, stories that turn into critique. So a counter narrative basically says the lived experiences that fall outside of the normative mainstream telling of human experience. And I don't think there is a counter narrative monolith. It has to be counter narratives, plural, because otherwise you're just creating a secondary, less dominant narrative, right? And one of the themes here, and I think the themes that also was a thread in the previous panels, is of course of lived experience. And I just want to go over how the three of you talked about lived experiences in your papers. So Upasana, you talked about how people with neurocognitive differences started using their lived experience to challenge this hegemonic structure of normalcy. This was also a response to the dominant narrative of ability and disability, right? So you brought up the tension between neurodiversity and disability, where we know that disability movements prior to the 2000s, but even after Judy Singer was writing, up till date, and in many spaces, were looking at structural determinants and not really focusing on the lived experience of people who are neurocognitively different, right? And then Kanika, you talked about a theoretical idea of what it looks like, but through the medium of film. Because again, hum bahut theory bolte hain. Right, but when you say lived experience and you see it on a screen or you hear that story in front of you, I could talk about spectrums or movements, but if the counter-narrative is a story, then it becomes human and powerful when you can see or hear that story. And it builds empathy in ways which an academic discussion cannot. You also talked about caretakers, and I think there were a few questions about that, and I think that is really critical because we often talk about psychosocial disability as existing in the person, the individual, the singular organism, right, or in the structure, and we're not thinking about situating people in communities, in societies. So I really like that you addressed that. Vasu's paper ties these two together in a way. So the autoethnographic method tells a personal story, right? It says, from where I stand, this is what critique looks like. So you have an academic in front of you, and you're hearing about the research, but the academic is a person first, and the research is human first. And in Kanika's, in your paper, I mentioned empathy as a tool. What you've done is you've used vulnerability as a tool. Right? So we talk about functionality and productivity and neoliberal and capitalist structures and God knows what, but now you understand what it means, what it is to see through the eyes of caste, of severe mental illness and other identity standpoints, right? These are words that are thrown around all the time in mental health spaces. But an autoethnographic approach ties that down to the individual and the community. I'm actually also very grateful that you spoke about educational institutions, but we are also talking right now in an educational institution because we have lost a lot of people to the fact that educational institutions are incredibly discriminatory. We talk about Rohit Vemulla, we talk about Arvi, who was a young school student who was queer, but these are just the visible stories, right? And I'm mentioning two of the stories that, newspaper articles were written about, or two of the many names, but there are so many more names. So the fact that inequity in educational institutions is life-threatening, right? And you critique those structures and have started to provide solutions on what affirmative, inclusive, and just is the word. What does justice look like in educational institutions? And so now, I'm just going to, I was reading their papers and listening to them, and in 2013 or 14, there's an academic author called Alison Kafer who wrote a book called Feminist Queer Crip. Crip here stands for cripple. And it's a queer feminist, disability theory, mad pride. It's a combination of all of those things. And in this, Kafer proposes something that's called a political relational model of disability. And I thought of this because, Upasana, in your paper, you were talking about the different models, right, the different approaches. And I have hung on to the political relational model for now over 10 years. Kafer acknowledges the critique of the medical individual model as it creates a dichotomy between able-bodied, able-minded, and disabled. But the social model, or what we now call the psychosocial model, also creates a distinction between impairment, as you've said, and disability. In the psychosocial model, impairment is seen as a physical, mental condition, but disability somehow is structural, it's social, right? And there's a quote from Kafer, which I pulled out this morning, and maybe it'll illustrate what I'm trying to say a little better. Kafer writes, people with chronic illness, pain, and fatigue rightly note that structural change will do little to make one's joints stop aching. As a result, the social model can marginalize those disabled people who are interested in medical interventions. So, if a psychosocial model is in response to a biomedical model, what we are navigating right now in many mental health spaces, it's a dichotomy that we're creating between these two. This political relational model approaches disability as a site for political reimagining and collective organizing. She sees disability as relational. And now, Kanika, I'm thinking about your paper, that disability is experienced in and through relationships with others around them. So when you had mentioned caretakers, I was thinking of that. And that everyone's personal experience with disability is not just one as a disabled person, but that my relationality to those around me also determines to an extent how I experience this, and that disability is this complex thing where it's constantly shifting because I'm not surrounded by the same people at the same time. My disability right now looks different on this stage than it will when I go and get a cup of tea after this, right? So, yeah, there is basically no such thing as disability existing in a vacuum. But what I really like about this particular model is that it acknowledges that there has been, and I will say 10-something years later, there continues to be a depoliticization of disability, right? Disability has been constructed in a way that it does not engage across intersections, and you've heard it in various ways from this panel. And it does not engage in self-reflexivity. It does not think about its own complicity in creating and reinforcing. And I think, Vasu, you've so beautifully put the way that disability really just, the failure for reflexivity there is failing so many disabled people. And so our panelists have pointed out instances of where disability did not think about neurodivergence, did not think about gender or caste or sexuality or class as central to the lived experience of disability. So this political relational model, it gives space for disability to be messy, to be used as a site for activism and advocacy and change, to like leverage this lived experience to making change. How do you utilize lived experience as the thing that makes change? Whether it's educational institutions or policy or government or organizations, and that disability needs to be seen as having a future, because the social model cannot eradicate disability and the medical model cannot cure it, right? And I really want to thank the panelists, because this panel was not just about the past and the present of mental health and disability. It also proposed what disability might look like, right? So the lived experience critiques of today, these counter narratives, have the potential then to determine the futures of disability. And so for that, I am very grateful. I am looking at the clock. Oh, 5 p.m. Who is going to thank me for finishing exactly on time?